Sometimes the most powerful people in the room are the ones nobody expects. Sometimes a single moment can shatter every assumption, every prejudice, every cruel intention. This is the story of Sarah Martinez, a woman who walked into a military recruitment center as a target for humiliation and walked out having silenced an entire room of hardened soldiers. What they saw was a quiet woman in simple clothes, someone they thought they could break. What they didn't see was a story written in ink across her spine, a story that would make a decorated commander freeze mid-sentence and force an entire unit to confront the difference between looking tough and actually being strong. This isn't just about a tattoo. It's about the moment when truth collides with assumption, when respect is earned not through words but through scars, and when the most unlikely person becomes the most unforgettable presence in the room. Some stories change you. This one will change how you see strength itself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military recruitment center as Sarah Martinez pushed through the heavy glass doors. The building hummed with testosterone and authority, its walls lined with recruitment posters showing perfect soldiers in perfect uniforms doing perfect things. She stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and a plain white t-shirt that had seen better days. The waiting area buzzed with conversation, mostly young men comparing workout routines and bragging about their high school football achievements. A few women sat scattered among them, but they all seemed to fit a certain mold: athletic, confident, loud. Sarah found an empty chair in the corner and sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "Next batch for initial processing," a sergeant called out, his voice cutting through the chatter like a knife. 20 names were called, including Sarah's. She stood with the others and followed them down a sterile hallway toward what looked like a medical examination area. The processing room was divided into sections by temporary curtains. Men went to one side, women to the other. Sarah found herself in line behind 3 other women who were already deep in conversation about their college athletics and their reasons for joining the military. "I'm going for Special Forces," announced Kelly, a blonde woman who looked like she could bench press a small car. "Did 4 years of CrossFit and ran 2 marathons last year." "Air Force for me," said Maria, stretching her obviously toned arms above her head. "My dad was a pilot. Been preparing for this my whole life." The third woman, Jessica, nodded along. "Marines. I want the challenge. I've been doing MMA for 6 years." They all turned to look at Sarah expectantly. She offered a small smile but said nothing. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Kelly laughed, not kindly. "What about you, quiet girl? What's your story?" Sarah's voice was soft when she finally spoke. "I'm here to serve." The 3 women exchanged glances. Kelly's laugh got louder. "Serve what? Coffee? You look like you'd blow away in a strong breeze." The comment caught the attention of some of the men nearby, and soon Sarah found herself the center of unwanted attention. A guy named Brad, who'd been bragging about his football scholarship, leaned over the temporary barrier separating the men's and women's sections. "Hey, are you sure you're in the right place?" he called out, grinning at his own wit. "The community college is down the street." More laughter rippled through the room. Sarah's cheeks flushed, but she kept her eyes down and said nothing. She'd dealt with this kind of thing before. In her experience, it was better to stay quiet and let people move on to their next target. But they didn't move on. "Seriously, though," Kelly continued, emboldened by the audience, "what made you think you could handle military life? Have you ever even been in a fight?" "Look at those arms," Jessica added, pretending to examine Sarah's slender frame. "I bet I could snap them like twigs." The comments were getting crueler, and Sarah could feel every eye in the room on her. The other recruits were treating this like entertainment, their conversations dying down so they could listen to the show. Even some of the staff members seemed to be paying attention now, though they made no move to intervene. "Maybe she's here for the food," Brad suggested, still grinning. 3 squares a day, steady paycheck. Some people join for the benefits, not because they can actually do the job. Sarah's hands clenched slightly in her lap, but her voice remained steady when she finally looked up. "I'm here for the same reason as everyone else." "Which is?" Kelly pressed. "To serve my country." This brought another round of laughter from the group. Kelly shook her head in mock sympathy. "Honey, serving your country requires more than good intentions. It requires strength. Physical strength, mental strength, the ability to handle pressure." She gestured around the room. "Look around. Do you see anyone else here who looks like they need protection?" The cruelty in her voice was unmistakable now, and Sarah could see some of the other recruits starting to look uncomfortable. But nobody spoke up. Nobody told Kelly to back off. If anything, the silence seemed to encourage her. I mean, no offense, Kelly continued, though her tone suggested she intended plenty of offense. But the military isn't a charity. They can't just take anyone who shows up. There are standards. Physical standards, Jessica added. Mental standards. Standards that exist for a reason. Sarah finally raised her eyes to meet Kelly's gaze directly. For just a moment, something flickered there. Something that made Kelly take an involuntary step back. But it was gone so quickly that Kelly convinced herself she'd imagined it. Look, I'm not trying to be mean, Kelly said, though that was exactly what she was trying to be. I'm being realistic. The people you'd be serving with deserve better than someone who's going to be a liability in the field. They deserve people who can pull their weight, who won't break under pressure. The room had gone completely quiet now. Even the staff seemed to be listening, though they maintained their professional expressions. Sarah could feel the weight of everyone's expectations. They all wanted to see how she'd respond to this very public humiliation. She stood up slowly, her movements careful and controlled. For a second, Kelly looked triumphant, as if Sarah was about to leave in tears. Instead, Sarah simply said, "We'll see." Her voice was quiet, but something in those two words made the laughter die completely. There was no anger in her tone, no defensiveness, no hurt feelings on display, just a simple statement of fact that somehow carried more weight than all of Kelly's bluster. Before anyone could respond, a door at the far end of the room opened and Commander James Patterson walked in. He was exactly what Central Casting would order if they needed someone to play a military officer. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair and the kind of presence that made rooms go quiet. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his posture perfect, his expression all business. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried easily across the room. Welcome to your initial processing day. I'm Commander Patterson, and I'll be overseeing your evaluations. His eyes swept across the room, taking in each face with the kind of attention that made people stand a little straighter. When his gaze reached Sarah, it paused for just a fraction of a second longer than the others, but his expression remained neutral. Today you'll complete medical examinations, physical fitness assessments, aptitude tests, and psychological evaluations. Some of you will move forward in the process, some will not. The decisions made today are based on your ability to serve effectively, not on your personal feelings or assumptions about what a soldier should look like. His last comment seemed directed at the room in general, but several people, including Kelly, had the grace to look slightly ashamed. Medical examinations first, Commander Patterson continued. You'll be called back in small groups. The examination includes a complete physical, which means you'll need to remove your shirts for chest and back examinations. This is standard procedure and will be conducted by qualified medical personnel with appropriate privacy measures. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She'd known this was coming. It was part of every military medical examination. But knowing it and being ready for it were two different things. Around her, the other recruits were nodding and chatting casually about the process. None of them seemed concerned about removing their shirts in front of medical staff. None of them had what Sarah had on her back. First group, a medical technician called out, reading from a clipboard. Martinez, Thompson, Williams, Chen, and Rodriguez. Sarah's name was first on the list. She stood on unsteady legs and followed the group toward the medical examination area, very aware of Kelly's eyes on her back. The blonde woman was probably hoping Sarah would embarrass herself somehow during the physical examination. She had no idea how right she was and how wrong. The medical examination area was set up with several stations, each staffed by a different type of medical professional. Sarah and the other 4 recruits were directed to separate stations for the initial paperwork and basic measurements: height, weight, blood pressure, vision tests. The doctor examining Sarah was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and efficient movements. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had been conducting military medical examinations for over 15 years, and she'd seen just about everything. She worked through the standard checklist with professional competence, asking questions about medical history, checking reflexes, examining joints for mobility and strength. Any previous injuries I should know about? Walsh asked, making notes on her tablet. Some, Sarah replied quietly. Can you be more specific? Any broken bones, surgeries, ongoing medical issues? Sarah hesitated. Several broken bones. Some scarring. But everything healed properly. Dr. Walsh looked up from her tablet, studying Sarah's face more carefully. After 15 years of military medicine, she developed an instinct for reading between the lines. Recent injuries? No. They're old. How old? Several years. Dr. Walsh made another note, then set her tablet aside. All right, I need you to remove your shirt for the chest and back examination. You can keep your bra on. There's a gown you can put on afterward if you're more comfortable. Sarah nodded and reached for the hem of her t-shirt. Her hands were steady as she pulled it over her head, but inside her heart was racing. She folded the shirt carefully and set it on the chair beside her, then turned so Dr. Walsh could examine her back. Walsh had been reaching for her stethoscope when she looked up and saw Sarah's back. The medical instrument slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Covering Sarah's entire back, from her shoulder blades to just above her waistline, was a tattoo unlike anything Dr. Walsh had ever seen. It wasn't the kind of decorative artwork that many young people got these days. This was something else entirely. The centerpiece was a military unit insignia that Dr. Walsh recognized immediately, the distinctive symbol of the 75 Ranger Regiment, one of the Army's most elite special operations units. But it wasn't just the insignia. Surrounding it were names, dates, and coordinates in precise military formatting. Combat ribbons were rendered in perfect detail. And woven throughout it all was a memorial design that made Dr. Walsh's breath catch in her throat. "My God," she whispered, forgetting her professional composure completely. Sarah's shoulders tensed. She'd known this moment would come, but that didn't make it any easier. "Doctor, I can explain." "No need to explain anything," Dr. Walsh said, her voice filled with something that sounded like awe. "May I?" She gestured toward the tattoo. Sarah nodded, and Dr. Fitz approved. Walsh moved closer, studying the intricate details. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, but that wasn't what had caught her attention. It was what the tattoo represented. Each element told part of a story, and as Dr. Walsh read the names and dates, she began to understand what kind of story it was. "How long were you deployed?" "Doctor?" Walsh asked softly. 3 2s. "Afghanistan." "What unit?" Sarah's voice was barely audible. 75th Rangers. 3rd Battalion. "Doctor." Walsh stepped back, her expression completely transformed. She'd examined thousands of recruits over the years, but she'd never had a member of one of the Army's most elite units sitting in her examination room pretending to be a civilian applicant. "The medical examination can wait," Dr. Walsh said, reaching for her phone. "Commander Patterson needs to see this." Commander Patterson was reviewing test scores in his office when his phone buzzed with an urgent message from Dr. Walsh. The text was brief but compelling. "Need you in Medical Station 3 immediately. Regarding Sarah Martinez. You need to see this yourself." He'd worked with Dr. Walsh long enough to know she didn't use the word urgent lightly. Setting aside his paperwork, he made his way quickly through the corridors toward the medical examination area. The building was quieter now, with most of the morning's recruits deep into their various assessments. When he reached Medical Station 3, he found Dr. Parker. Walsh waiting outside the examination room, her expression serious and somewhat stunned. She gestured for him to follow her inside, where Sarah sat on the examination table, her shirt still off, facing away from the door. Commander Patterson had served in the military for 28 years. He'd seen combat in 3 different theaters, commanded units in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, and worked with some of the most elite soldiers the Army had to offer. But when he saw Sarah's back, he stopped dead in his tracks. The tattoo was breathtaking in its detail and devastating in its meaning. The 75th Ranger Regiment insignia dominated the center, rendered with perfect accuracy in bold black ink. Surrounding it were elements that told a story Patterson recognized all too well. The story of soldiers who'd served in the hardest places, doing the most dangerous work, paying the highest prices. Along Sarah's left shoulder blade were coordinates that Patterson immediately recognized as locations in Afghanistan's Kunar province, some of the most hostile territory American forces had operated in. Below those were dates spanning 3 years, marking deployments that overlapped with some of the bloodiest periods of the conflict. But it was the memorial section that made Patterson's chest tighten. Running down Sarah's spine were names, 8 of them, each followed by dates and ages. All young, all died in combat. And woven among the names were small symbols that Patterson knew represented specific battles, specific operations, specific moments when good soldiers didn't come home. At the bottom of the tattoo, just above her waistline, was a phrase in elegant script, "Until Valhalla." The traditional farewell of warriors, a promise that the fallen would be remembered until the living joined them in the Hall of Heroes. Sarah had remained silent during Patterson's examination of her tattoo, but she could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere. The same design that had marked her as different, as someone with a story worth knowing, was now creating the very situation she'd hoped to avoid. "Sergeant Martinez," Patterson said quietly, using her former rank for the first time. Sarah's shoulders sagged slightly. It's just Sarah now, sir. Turn around. She did, pulling her shirt back on as she faced him. Patterson studied her face, seeing things he'd missed during his initial assessment. The quiet confidence that he'd attributed to shyness, the way she'd stood when Kelly had been taunting her, not defensive, but ready. The look in her eyes when she'd said, "We'll see," not hope, but knowledge. "Walsh, would you give us some privacy?" Patterson requested. The doctor nodded and stepped out, closing the door behind her. Patterson remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in a formal posture that Sarah recognized from countless briefings. 3 tours with the Rangers, Patterson said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. 3rd Battalion. Yes, sir. Afghanistan. Kunar Province primarily, based on those coordinates. Sarah nodded. Among other places. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, processing what he was seeing. The 75th Ranger Regiment was one of the Army's premier special operations units. Getting into the Rangers required passing some of the most rigorous training in the military. Surviving 3 combat tours with them was something very few people could claim. "What was your MOS?" he asked, referring to her military occupational specialty. 11B, infantryman. Later cross-trained as a combat medic. Patterson's eyebrows rose slightly. An infantry soldier who'd also trained as a medic, someone who could fight and save lives with equal skill. It was a rare combination, and an invaluable one in special operations. "The name's on your back," he said carefully. "Your unit?" Sarah's voice was steady, but Patterson could see the cost of the memories in her eyes. "Some of them. The ones I was closest to. The ones She trailed off, then continued more quietly. "The ones I couldn't save." Now Patterson understood why she was here, sitting in a recruitment center, applying to join the military as if she were a civilian with no experience. He'd seen it before, though, rarely. Soldiers who'd left the service after traumatic experiences, only to realize that civilian life couldn't fill the hole that military service had left behind. "Why didn't you mention your service record on your application?" Patterson asked. Sarah was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "Because I wasn't sure I deserved to." The honesty of that statement hit Patterson harder than he'd expected. He'd been in the military long enough to know that some of the best soldiers were the ones who questioned themselves the most, who carried the weight of their choices and their losses with them long after the battles were over. "Those people out there," Sarah continued, gesturing toward the main processing area, "they think they know what strength looks like. They think it's about being loud, being aggressive, being fearless. But real strength?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Real strength is about doing the job when you're terrified. It's about carrying people when you're broken yourself. It's about making impossible choices and living with the consequences." Patterson nodded slowly. "And you don't think you have that anymore?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "I lost 8 people under my command, 8 people who trusted me to bring them home. Maybe Kelly is right. Maybe I am a liability." "Kelly?" The woman in the waiting area. She was explaining to everyone why I don't belong here. Patterson's expressions hardened slightly. He'd missed the confrontation in the waiting area, but he was beginning to piece together what had happened. A group of civilian recruits had decided to humiliate a former special operations soldier because she didn't look like their idea of what a warrior should be. "What happened to those 8 soldiers?" Patterson asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Sarah's hands clenched slightly in her lap. "IED hit our convoy in the Karangal Valley. The blast flipped our vehicle. Half the unit was trapped inside, unconscious, badly injured. The enemy was closing in from 3 sides. We had maybe 10 minutes before they'd overrun our position." She stopped, lost in the memory for a moment before continuing. "I got the survivors out. All of them. But I couldn't save everyone. 8 didn't make it home. How many did make it home?" 14. Patterson did the math quickly. Sarah had been responsible for a unit of 22 soldiers. She'd lost 8 but saved 14. In the kind of ambush she was describing, survival rates were usually much worse. "You saved 14 people," Patterson said quietly. "I lost 8. You saved 14 people under fire, while wounded yourself probably." He paused. "You were wounded, weren't you?" Sarah nodded reluctantly. "Shrapnel from the initial blast, nothing serious." Patterson doubted that. In his experience, Rangers had a different definition of nothing serious than most people. Shrapnel wounds that would hospitalize a civilian were often treated as minor inconveniences by special operations soldiers. So you saved 14 people while wounded under fire with enemy forces closing in on 3 sides, Patterson summarized. And you think that makes you a liability? Sarah didn't answer immediately. The logic was clear when he put it that way, but logic and guilt were 2 different things. Those 8 families deserved better. They got the best. Patterson replied firmly. They got a soldier who risked everything to save as many as possible. They got someone who's been carrying their memory ever since, honoring their sacrifice by questioning whether she did enough. He walked to the small window in the examination room and looked out toward the main processing area. Through the glass, he could see the recruits still going through their various assessments. Kelly among them, probably still feeling pleased with herself for putting the quiet woman in her place. You know what I see when I look at those recruits out there? Patterson asked. Sarah shook her head. I see people who think they understand sacrifice because they've given up their weekend plans to work out. I see people who think they understand courage because they're brave enough to apply for military service. I see people who think they understand loss because they've had their hearts broken or didn't make the team they wanted to make. He turned back to face her. And then I see you. Someone who actually knows what all of those things mean. Someone who's already proven herself in the hardest possible circumstances. Someone who's earned the right to wear that tattoo and everything it represents. Sarah looked down at her hands. I'm not the same person who earned that tattoo. That was before. Before I lost them. Before I came home and couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function. Before I spent 2 years in therapy trying to remember how to be around people without calculating exit strategies and threat assessments. You think that makes you weaker? Patterson asked. Doesn't it? It makes you human. Patterson sat down in the chair across from her, abandoning his formal posture. You know what the difference is between you and everyone else out there? They're here because they think military service will make them strong. You're here because you already know what strength costs, and you're willing to pay that price again. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing his words. The other recruits, they see someone they can break, someone who doesn't belong. The other recruits see what they expect to see, Patterson corrected. They see someone small and quiet and assume that means weak. They don't know how to recognize real strength because they've never been tested themselves. He stood up and walked back to the window. You want to know what I think happened out there? I think Kelly and her friends saw someone who didn't fit their image of what a soldier should look like, and they decided to have some fun at her expense. They thought they found an easy target. They did. No, Patterson said firmly. They found someone with nothing to prove to them. Someone who's already been to war and back. Someone who's already sacrificed more than they can imagine. The fact that you didn't rise to their bait doesn't make you weak, it makes you disciplined. Sarah looked up at him for the first time since the conversation had begun. You really believe that? I believe the evidence, Patterson replied. 3 tours with the Rangers. 14 people brought home alive from an impossible situation. A tattoo that honors the fallen while celebrating the bonds that make elite units possible. That's not the record of someone who's weak or broken. He paused, then continued more gently. But I also believe in giving people the chance to prove themselves. If you want to come back to military service, you shouldn't have to hide who you are or what you've done. You've earned the right to wear that service with pride. What if they're right, though? Sarah asked quietly. What if I really am different now? What if I can't handle the pressure anymore? Then you'll find out during training, same as everyone else, Patterson replied. But you won't be starting from zero. You'll be starting from a foundation that most soldiers spend years trying to build. He walked back to the door and paused with his hand on the handle. The question isn't whether you're the same person who earned that tattoo. The question is whether you're ready to find out who you are now. Sarah sat in silence for several minutes after Patterson left, staring at her reflection in the mirror mounted on the examination room wall. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who'd walked into the recruitment center that morning. Not because anything had changed, but because someone had finally seen what was really there. When? Dr. Walsh returned to complete the medical examination. She found Sarah sitting straighter, her shoulders back, her expression calm but focused. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable. Everything all right? Dr. Walsh asked. Sarah nodded. Better than all right, as Doctor said. Walsh completed the rest of the examination. She made notes about Sarah's excellent physical condition, her quick reflexes, and the kind of muscle memory that spoke of extensive training. But she also made notes about something else she observed, the way Sarah carried herself now, the confidence that had replaced the uncertainty. When the examination was complete, Sarah dressed quickly and prepared to return to the main processing area. As she reached for the door handle, Dr. Patrick Walsh called out to her, "Sergeant Martinez?" Sarah turned back. "Thank you," Dr. Walsh said, simply, "for your service, and for reminding me that heroes don't always look like what we expect them to look like." Sarah nodded once, then opened the door and stepped back into the hallway. The main processing area was just ahead, filled with the same recruits who'd watched her humiliation earlier that morning. Kelly was probably still there, probably still feeling pleased with herself. But Sarah Martinez was no longer the same person who'd walked out of that room an hour earlier. She was someone who'd been reminded of who she was and what she'd accomplished. Someone who'd been given permission to be proud of her service instead of ashamed of her losses. And she was about to give everyone in that room a lesson they'd never forget about the difference between looking strong and actually being strong. Sarah walked back into the main processing area with a different energy than when she'd left. The change wasn't obvious to casual observers. She still moved quietly, still chose a seat away from the main groups of recruits. But there was something in her posture now, a subtle shift in how she held herself, that spoke of someone who'd remembered who they were. The room was in the middle of physical fitness testing. Several stations had been set up with different equipment, pull-up bars, areas for push-ups and sit-ups, and a track marked out for running assessments. The recruits were rotating through the stations in groups, with fitness instructors recording their scores and making notes about their performance. Kelly was at the pull-up station, making a show of her impressive performance. She managed 15 strict pull-ups, drawing appreciative comments from the other recruits, and an approving nod from the fitness instructor. When she finished, she made a point of flexing slightly and grinning at the small crowd that had gathered to watch. "Beat that," she called out to no one in particular, though her eyes found Sarah across the room. "Come on, quiet girl. Let's see what you've got." The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. The other recruits turned to look at Sarah expectantly, waiting to see if she'd take the bait this time or continue to avoid confrontation. Even some of the staff members paused their activities to watch. Sarah stood up from her chair and walked toward the pull-up station with steady, measured steps. The crowd parted to make room for her, and she could hear Kelly's confident laughter behind her. "This should be interesting," Kelly said to Jessica, not bothering to lower her voice. "I'm guessing 3, maybe 4, if she's lucky." Sarah reached the pull-up bar and looked up at it for a moment, as if assessing the challenge. Around her, the room had gone quieter than it had been all day. Everyone wanted to see what would happen when the quiet woman finally had to prove herself physically. She reached up and grasped the bar with an overhand grip, her hands positioned exactly shoulder-width apart. Her form was textbook perfect, something that would have meant more to the observers if they'd known enough about proper pull-up technique to recognize it. The first pull-up was smooth and controlled, her chin clearing the bar with room to spare, before she lowered herself back down to full arm extension. No wasted motion, no swinging or kicking for momentum. Just pure functional strength applied with mechanical precision. The second pull-up was identical to the first, then the third, then the fourth. By the fifth pull-up, the confident expressions were beginning to fade from some faces in the crowd. By the 10th, Kelly's smirk had disappeared entirely. By the 15th, the room was dead silent except for the sound of Sarah's controlled breathing. She passed Kelly's score of 15 without any sign of slowing down. 16, 17, 18. Her form remained perfect. Each repetition controlled and precise. There was no strain visible in her face, no shaking in her arms. 20. 21, 22. Now the fitness instructor was paying close attention, no longer just recording numbers but watching Sarah's technique with professional interest. In his 10 years of conducting military fitness assessments, he'd rarely seen this level of performance, especially from someone who looked as unassuming as Sarah did. 25, 26, 27. Brad, who'd been making jokes earlier about Sarah being in the wrong place, was staring with his mouth slightly open. Jessica had stopped pretending to stretch and was watching with obvious amazement. Even Kelly seemed transfixed, though her expression was no longer confident. 30, 31, 32. Sarah's breathing was still controlled, though deeper now. Her movements remained precise, but the observer could see the increased effort in the slight pause she took between repetitions. She was reaching the limits of what even exceptional upper body strength could accomplish. 35, 36, 37. The fitness instructor was making notes furiously now, occasionally glancing up to verify what he was seeing. 37 perfect pull-ups was a score that would be impressive for a male special operations candidate. For a woman of Sarah's size, it was extraordinary. Sarah lowered herself from the bar after the 37th repetition and hung there for a moment, breathing deeply. The room was completely silent, everyone waiting to see if she would attempt another rep or call it finished. She looked around at the faces watching her, her gaze finally settling on Kelly. Then, without a word, she pulled herself up for the 38th time. When she finally released the bar and dropped back to the ground, the silence stretched for several long seconds. The fitness instructor was the first to break it. 38, he announced, his voice carrying a note of professional respect. That's the highest score we've recorded today. Outstanding performance. Sarah nodded once in acknowledgement, then began walking back toward her seat as if nothing unusual had happened. Behind her, the crowd of recruits was beginning to buzz with conversation, but it was a very different kind of talk than had been happening earlier in the day. How the hell did she do that? Brad was asking anyone who would listen. She's like half the size of me and just did twice as many pull-ups as I did. That was insane, Maria added, shaking her head in amazement. I've never seen anything like that. Kelly remained silent, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. She was staring after Sarah with an expression that mixed respect, confusion, and something that might have been embarrassment. But the pull-ups were just the beginning. At the push-up station, Sarah dropped down into perfect position. Hands placed precisely, body forming a straight line from head to heels, feet close together. The fitness instructor started the timer and Sarah began. Her push-ups were textbook examples of proper form. Full range of motion, controlled tempo, no sagging hips or partial reps. She moved like someone who'd done this particular exercise thousands of times. Like someone for whom physical fitness wasn't a hobby or a challenge, but simply a basic requirement of daily life. 50 push-ups. 60, 70. The other recruits had stopped their own exercises now and were gathering around to watch. Sarah's performance was becoming the main event of the day, though she seemed completely unaware of the attention she was drawing. 80, 90, 100. At 100 push-ups, the fitness instructor called out the number, expecting Sarah to stop. Instead, she continued without pause. 110, 120. Now even the staff members were stopping their work to watch. Word was spreading through the building that something unusual was happening in the fitness testing area. A few officers had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. 150, 160, 170. Sarah's form remained perfect throughout, though the effort was clearly increasing. Her breathing was deeper now, and there was a slight tremor in her arms between repetitions. But she showed no signs of stopping. When she finally finished at 185 perfect push-ups, the room erupted in spontaneous applause. Even Kelly found herself clapping, though she looked like she couldn't quite believe what she was doing. The fitness instructor was reviewing his notes with obvious amazement. 185 perfect push-ups, he announced to the room. That's a new facility record for women, and it would be impressive for our male candidates as well. Sarah stood up from the ground, brushing off her hands, and looked around at the faces watching her. The expressions she saw now were very different from the ones that had greeted her that morning. Instead of dismissal and contempt, she saw respect, amazement, and in some cases a dawning realization that they'd made some very wrong assumptions. Commander Patterson had entered the room during the push-up demonstration and had been watching from the back of the crowd. Now he stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes sharp with interest. Ms. Martinez, he called out, using her civilian title deliberately. Would you mind demonstrating your running performance as well? Sarah nodded and followed him toward the track area that had been marked out in the building's gymnasium. The other recruits trailed behind, no longer making jokes or snide comments, but watching with genuine curiosity about what this quiet woman might do next. The running test was a timed 2-mile run, designed to assess cardiovascular fitness and endurance. Most of the recruits had completed it earlier in respectable but unremarkable times, anywhere from 14 to 18 minutes, depending on their fitness level. Sarah took her position at the starting line, performing a few quick stretches that demonstrated the kind of flexibility that comes from years of consistent training. Her movements were efficient and purposeful, with no wasted motion or unnecessary show. Ready? The timer asked. Sarah nodded. Go! She took off at a pace that immediately marked her as different from the other recruits. While most people started running tests either too fast, and burned out early, or too slow, and couldn't make up time later. Sarah settled into a rhythm that spoke of someone who understood pacing. Someone who knew exactly what her body could do over a sustained distance. Her form was economical and efficient. No wasted energy in unnecessary arm movements or inefficient stride patterns. She ran like someone who'd covered thousands of miles in training and in combat conditions. Someone who understood that running wasn't just about fitness, but could be the difference between life and death. Lap after lap, she maintained the same steady pace. The other recruits watched from the sidelines, timing her splits and realizing that she was on track for something exceptional. By the halfway point, it was clear that she was going to demolish the best time recorded that day. Mile 1, 6 minutes and 45 seconds. An impressive split that she maintained without any visible increase in effort or breathing difficulty. Mile 2, 13 minutes and 30 seconds, total time. When Sarah crossed the finish line, she wasn't even breathing particularly hard. She cooled down with the same methodical approach she'd brought to everything else, performing stretches and recovery movements that demonstrated extensive knowledge of proper athletic technique. The fitness instructor was staring at his stopwatch as if it were broken. 13:30, he announced to the room. That's faster than most of our male candidates, and it's the fastest time we've recorded from any female candidate in over 2 years. Commander Patterson nodded approvingly, though his expression remained carefully neutral. He'd seen what he needed to see, and it confirmed everything he'd suspected after seeing Sarah's tattoo and hearing her story. As Sarah finished her cool-down routine, the other recruits began approaching her with a very different energy than they'd shown earlier in the day. The mockery and dismissal were gone, replaced by genuine curiosity and respect. "Where did you learn to do that?" Maria asked, her earlier confidence replaced by obvious admiration. "Have you been training for this for a long time?" Jessica added. Even Brad seemed eager to associate himself with Sarah's success. "That was incredible. I mean, I've never seen anything like that. You must have some serious athletic background." But it was Kelly who provided the moment everyone would remember. She approached Sarah hesitantly, her earlier bravado completely gone, replaced by something that looked like shame mixed with respect. "I owe you an apology," Kelly said quietly, though her voice carried in the suddenly quiet room. "I was wrong about you. Completely wrong. I said some things earlier that were unfair and cruel, and I'm sorry." Sarah studied Kelly's face for a moment, seeing genuine remorse there.
"Apology accepted. Can I ask?" Kelly hesitated, then continued.
"How did you get so strong?" "I mean, I train constantly, and I've never seen anyone perform like that." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering how much to reveal. Finally, she said simply, "Practice. Lots and lots of practice." It was true, as far as it went. But it wasn't the whole truth, and everyone in the room sensed that there was more to Sarah's story than she was letting on. The way she moved, the way she approached each exercise with perfect form and technique, the way she seemed completely unfazed by performances that left everyone else amazed, it all spoke of someone with professional-level training and experience. Commander Patterson cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to him. "All right, everyone. Impressive performances all around, but we still have more assessments to complete. Academic testing is next, followed by psychological evaluations." As the group began to disperse toward the next round of testing, Patterson caught Sarah's eye and nodded slightly. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight, an acknowledgement from one professional to another, a recognition of what he'd just witnessed. The rest of the recruits filed out of the gym, chattering excitedly about Sarah's performance and speculating about her background. But Sarah remained behind for a moment, alone with the pull-up bar and the track where she'd just reminded herself of who she really was. For the first time since walking into the recruitment center that morning, she felt like herself again. Not the broken veteran who'd spent 2 years questioning her worth, not the quiet woman who'd accepted other people's assumptions about her limitations, but Sergeant Sarah Martinez, 75th Rangers, someone who'd earned the right to be proud of what she could do. The academic and psychological testing that followed would be important for her official evaluation, but the real test, the one that mattered most to her own sense of self-worth, had already been passed with flying colors. The academic testing phase revealed another layer of Sarah's capabilities that surprised everyone who'd written her off that morning. While the other recruits struggled through sections on military history, tactical scenarios, and technical problem-solving, Sarah moved through the examination with the same quiet efficiency she'd demonstrated during physical testing. The test proctor, Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, had been administering these assessments for 5 years. She'd developed an eye for different types of candidates, the ones who were naturally smart but unprepared, the ones who'd studied hard but lacked intuitive understanding, and the rare ones who seemed to grasp concepts immediately and apply them with practical wisdom. Sarah fell into that last category, but with a twist that Sergeant Rodriguez found intriguing. While most exceptional candidates showed their intelligence through speed and obvious confidence, Sarah's approach was different. She read each question carefully, considered her options methodically, and selected her answers with what appeared to be practical experience rather than theoretical knowledge. The military history section was particularly revealing. Instead of answering questions about famous battles and strategic theories like a student who'd memorized textbook information, Sarah responded like someone who understood the practical realities behind the historical events. Her answers demonstrated not just knowledge of what had happened, but understanding of why it had happened, and what lessons could be applied to modern situations. When the testing was complete, Sergeant Rodriguez found herself reviewing Sarah's scores with the same amazement the fitness instructors had shown earlier. Perfect scores across all sections weren't unheard of, but they were rare. Perfect scores combined with the kind of practical insight Sarah had demonstrated were almost unprecedented. But it was during the psychological evaluation that the most significant revelation occurred. Dr. Robert Chen had been conducting psychological assessments for military candidates for over 12 years. His job was to identify potential problems, candidates who might break under stress, who had unrealistic expectations about military service, or who were joining for the wrong reasons. He'd developed sophisticated techniques for getting past the facades that most applicants presented and discovering what kind of person they really were underneath. Sarah presented a unique challenge for his assessment methods. Most candidates came in either trying to appear tougher than they were or struggling to hide obvious anxieties about military service. Sarah seemed completely calm and centered, answering his questions with thoughtful honesty but without revealing much about her deeper motivations or concerns. "Tell me about your decision to join the military, Dr." Chen began, using his standard opening approach. "I want to serve my country," Sarah replied simply. "Can you be more specific? What aspects of military service appeal to you?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "The opportunity to be part of something larger than myself, to work with people who are committed to the same values, to know that what I'm doing matters." Dr. Chen made notes, observing that Sarah's answers were sincere but somewhat generic. Most candidates gave similar responses, though few delivered them with her level of apparent conviction. He decided to probe deeper. "What concerns do you have about military service? What aspects worry you the most?" This question usually revealed a lot about candidates' self-awareness and realistic understanding of what they were signing up for. Sarah's response was more telling than she probably intended. "I'm concerned about being responsible for other people again," she said quietly, "about making decisions that affect others' lives and safety." The word "again" caught Dr. Chen's attention immediately. Most candidates worried about responsibility in general terms, the abstract concept of being accountable for important things. Sarah's concern was much more specific and personal, suggesting prior experience with serious responsibility. "Can you tell me more about that?" he asked. Sarah hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "I've been in positions before where my choices affected other people's well-being. Sometimes those choices didn't work out the way I hoped." Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly. This was the first indication that Sarah had significant prior experience with leadership or responsibility. Combined with her exceptional performance in the fitness and academic testing, it was beginning to paint a picture that didn't match her application materials. "What kind of positions?" he asked gently. "Leadership roles. Situations where people were depending on me to make good decisions under pressure." "In what context? Work, school, community organizations?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with how much to reveal. Finally, she said, "Military contexts." Dr. Chen felt his pulse quicken. "You've served before?" "Yes." "What branch?" "Army." "What was your rank?" "Sergeant." "What unit?" Another long pause. Then, 75th Ranger Regiment. Dr. Chen set down his pen and stared at Sarah in amazement. The 75th Ranger Regiment was one of the Army's most elite special operations units. Getting into the Rangers required passing some of the most rigorous selection and training programs in the military. Achieving the rank of sergeant in that environment meant Sarah had not only survived the initial training, but had excelled enough to be given leadership responsibilities over other Rangers. "How long did you serve?" he asked, his entire approach to the evaluation shifting now that he understood who he was talking to. 8 years. 3 combat tours. Afghanistan? Yes. Doctor. Chen was quiet for several minutes, reviewing his notes and reconsidering everything he'd observed about Sarah during the evaluation. Her calm demeanor, her thoughtful responses, her specific concerns about responsibility. All of it made perfect sense now that he understood her background. "Why did you leave?" he asked carefully. Sarah's expression tightened slightly. "I lost people under my command. 8 soldiers. I started questioning whether I was fit to lead others. Can you tell me about what happened?" Sarah described the ambush in the Korengal Valley, the impossible decisions, the 14 people she'd saved, and the 8 she couldn't. As she talked, Dr. Chen began to understand not just what had happened, but what it had cost her psychologically. "You've been dealing with survivor's guilt," he observed when she finished. "Among other things. PTSD, depression, anxiety. I spent 2 years in therapy learning how to function in civilian life. And now you want to return to military service. I need to know if I still can. If I'm still the person I was before." Dr. Chen leaned back in his chair, processing everything he'd learned. From a clinical perspective, Sarah's psychological profile was actually quite positive. She'd experienced trauma but had sought appropriate treatment. She was self-aware about her limitations and concerns. Her motivation for returning to service was healthy and realistic, rather than driven by unresolved emotional issues. But more than that, she was clearly an exceptional candidate who was hiding her qualifications out of misplaced doubt about her own worth. Dr. Chen had never encountered a situation quite like this before. "Sarah," he said, using her first name for the first time, "do you understand how rare your qualifications are? Do you realize what an asset you would be to any unit you joined?" Sarah shook her head. "I'm not the same person I was. I've been broken. I've been weak." "You've been human," Dr. Chen corrected gently. "You experienced something traumatic, acknowledged its impact on you, and sought help to deal with it. That's not weakness, that's strength and wisdom." He pulled out a fresh evaluation form and began making notes. "Based on everything I've observed today, you're one of the strongest candidates I've ever evaluated. Not just physically, though your fitness scores are exceptional. Not just intellectually, though your academic performance was outstanding. But psychologically, you have realistic expectations, healthy motivations, extensive experience, proven leadership capability, and the self-awareness to seek help when you need it." Sarah looked skeptical. "What about the PTSD? The anxiety? The fact that I've spent 2 years questioning my own judgment? What about it?" "Dr. Chen replied, "You're managing your PTSD effectively. Your anxiety is focused on realistic concerns rather than irrational fears. And questioning your own judgment after experiencing trauma shows wisdom, not weakness. The fact that you're here, willing to put yourself back into a position of responsibility despite your concerns, tells me that you've worked through your issues in a healthy way." He finished his notes and looked up at her. "Sarah, I'm going to recommend you for immediate consideration for advanced placement based on your prior service record. You shouldn't have to go through basic training again. You should be fast-tracked into a leadership development program where your experience and skills can be properly utilized." Sarah stared at him in amazement. "You really think I'm ready for that? I think you've been ready for that all along. You just needed to remember who you are." Dr. Kuo says, Chen's evaluation report made its way to Commander Patterson within an hour. Combined with the medical examination results, the fitness scores, and the academic testing performance, it painted a picture of an exceptional candidate who had been hiding in plain sight. Patterson called an impromptu meeting with all the assessment staff to discuss Sarah's case. The fitness instructors reported scores that would have been impressive for male special operations candidates. The academic testing revealed perfect scores across all sections with responses that demonstrated practical experience. The psychological evaluation confirmed what Patterson had suspected after seeing her tattoo. This was a highly qualified veteran who belonged in military service, not someone seeking entry-level training. "So what do we do?" asked Dr. Walsh, who had conducted the medical examination. "She applied as a civilian recruit, but she's clearly qualified for much more than that." "We give her what she deserves," Patterson replied. "Full recognition of her service record, advanced placement appropriate to her qualifications, and an opportunity to continue serving at the level she's earned." He paused, then added, "But first, I think it's time everyone else understood exactly who they've been dealing with today." Patterson made his way back to the main processing area, where the recruits were gathered for final briefings and scheduling of additional assessments. The atmosphere in the room was very different from what it had been that morning. Sarah's performance during fitness testing had shifted everyone's perception of her, but most still thought of her as someone with exceptional natural ability rather than professional training. Kelly had spent the afternoon in a state of growing embarrassment about her earlier behavior. She'd tried several times to approach Sarah to apologize more fully, but Sarah had been busy with testing and evaluations. Now, As the day was winding down, Kelly was wondering if she'd lost her chance to make things right. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patterson announced as he entered the room, his voice carrying the authority that made everyone stop their conversations and pay attention. "Before we conclude today's processing, I'd like to address something that came to light during our evaluations." He paused, his gaze settling on Sarah, who was sitting quietly in the same corner where she'd started the day. "This morning, some of you made assumptions about your fellow candidates based on appearance rather than capability. Some of you decided that you could judge someone's qualifications without knowing anything about their background or experience." The room was completely silent now, everyone sensing that something significant was about to be revealed. "I'd like you all to meet Sergeant Sarah Martinez," Patterson continued, emphasizing her military rank. "United States Army, 75th Ranger Regiment, 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, Bronze Star with V device for valor, Purple Heart, and numerous other commendations for exceptional service in special operations." The impact of his words was immediate and dramatic. Mouths dropped open around the room. Several recruits turned to stare at Sarah with expressions of shock and amazement. Kelly went pale, her hand covering her mouth in horror as she realized the magnitude of her morning's behavior. "Sergeant Martinez separated from active duty after 8 years of distinguished service, during which she served as a squad leader responsible for the safety and effectiveness of elite special operations soldiers in some of the most dangerous territory on Earth," Patterson continued. "Her performance today in fitness testing, academic assessment, and psychological evaluation confirms that she remains an exceptional candidate who would be an asset to any unit."
He let that sink in for a moment before concluding.
"I trust this serves as a valuable lesson about the danger of making assumptions about people based on superficial characteristics. In the military and in life, strength comes in many forms. Real strength is often quiet, disciplined, and focused on the mission rather than on seeking attention or validation from others." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Everyone in the room was reconsidering their interactions with Sarah throughout the day, realizing how differently things might have gone if they'd approached her with respect rather than dismissal. It was Brad who broke the silence, his voice subdued with embarrassment. "Sergeant Martinez, I owe you a huge apology. The things I said this morning were completely out of line." "I had no idea. None of us did," Maria added quickly. "We were completely wrong about you." But all eyes turned to Kelly, who was clearly struggling with the weight of her realization. She'd spent the morning publicly humiliating a decorated war veteran, someone who had sacrificed more for her country than Kelly could even comprehend. The shame on her face was obvious to everyone in the room. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity as Kelly struggled to find words adequate for the situation. Her face had gone through several shades of pale as the reality of her behavior sank in. She had spent the morning publicly mocking and attempting to humiliate a decorated special operations veteran, someone who had served 3 combat tours and earned commendations for valor that Kelly couldn't even fully comprehend. Finally, Kelly stood up from her chair, her movements shaky and uncertain. Every eye in the room was on her as she walked across the space toward where Sarah sat. When she reached Sarah's chair, Kelly did something that surprised everyone present. She dropped to one knee in a position that unmistakably resembled military respect. "Sergeant Martinez," Kelly said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know how to begin apologizing for what I did to you today. I called you weak. I questioned your right to be here. I tried to humiliate you in front of everyone." Her voice cracked slightly. "And you're a war hero. You're everything I'm trying to become, and I was too ignorant and arrogant to see it." Sarah looked down at Kelly with an expression that was impossible to read. Around the room, the other recruits watched in complete silence, many of them clearly uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment, but unable to look away.
"Please stand up,"
Sarah said quietly.
"You don't need to kneel."
Kelly rose slowly, but remained standing directly in front of Sarah's chair. "I need you to know that everything I said this morning came from my own insecurity and ignorance. I saw someone who didn't fit my stupid narrow idea of what a soldier should look like, and instead of recognizing that my assumptions might be wrong, I decided to tear you down to make myself feel better." She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "I spent 4 years playing college sports and thought that made me tough. I've been doing CrossFit and telling myself I understand discipline, but you've actually been there. You've actually done the things I'm just dreaming about doing, and instead of recognizing that and trying to learn from you, I treated you like you were beneath me." Sarah remained silent, her expression thoughtful but not unkind. The room was so quiet that people could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. "I know an apology isn't enough," Kelly continued, I know I can't take back the things I said, or the way I tried to make you feel. But I need you to know that meeting you, really understanding who you are, has taught me more about humility and real strength in one day than I learned in 4 years of college athletics. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, her contact information, written in careful handwriting. I don't deserve it, but if you're ever willing to give me a chance to prove that I'm better than what I showed you today, I'd be honored to learn from you. Even if it's just to buy you coffee and listen to whatever wisdom you're willing to share. Sarah took the paper and looked at it for a moment, then raised her eyes to meet Kelly's directly. What she saw there was genuine remorse, real recognition of the harm that had been done, and something that might have been the beginning of actual respect. Kelly, Sarah said finally, her voice calm and measured. We all make mistakes. We all have moments when we let our assumptions and insecurities drive our behavior instead of our better judgment. What matters isn't that you made those mistakes. It's what you do with the lesson you've learned from them. Kelly nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. The fact that you can recognize what happened and take responsibility for it tells me more about your character than anything you said this morning, Sarah continued. That takes courage, real courage. The kind that actually matters in military service. Sarah stood up from her chair, bringing herself to nearly eye level with Kelly. I accept your apology. More than that, I respect the way you've chosen to make it. And I'd be happy to have that coffee with you sometime. The relief on Kelly's face was immediate and profound. She extended her hand to Sarah, who took it in a firm handshake that seemed to close the door on the morning's events and open a new chapter in their relationship. But Sarah wasn't finished. She turned to address the room as a whole, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the space. I want everyone to understand something, she began. Kelly's apology means something because she took the time to really think about what happened and why it was wrong. But the lesson here isn't just about treating veterans with respect. It's about treating everyone with respect until they give you a reason not to. She paused, making eye contact with several of the recruits around the room. Every person in this room has value. Every person has strengths and experiences that could teach the rest of us something important. The mistake wasn't in not recognizing my service record. How could you have known that? The mistake was in deciding that someone who looked different or acted different must be weak or unworthy. Brad, who had also participated in the morning's mockery, spoke up from across the room. And I owe you an apology too. We all do. Several other voices joined in, offering their own apologies and expressions of respect. Sarah accepted each one graciously, but she could see that some of the recruits were still struggling with embarrassment and self-recrimination. Look, she said, raising her voice slightly to address the whole group. I don't want anyone leaving here today feeling terrible about themselves. Yes, some mistakes were made. Yes, some lessons were learned. But the real test isn't what you did wrong this morning. It's what you do with what you've learned going forward. She gestured toward Kelly, who was still standing nearby. Kelly showed real courage in how she handled her apology. That tells me she has the kind of character that can grow and improve. That's exactly the kind of person I'd want to serve alongside. Maria, who had been quieter during the morning's events but had certainly participated in some of the judgment, raised her hand tentatively. Sergeant Martinez, can I ask you something? Sarah nodded. When everyone was saying those things this morning, you just sat there and took it. You didn't defend yourself or tell us who you were or prove us wrong. Why? It was a perceptive question, and Sarah considered it carefully before answering. Because proving yourself to other people isn't your job. Your job is to be the best version of yourself you can be, regardless of whether anyone else recognizes it or appreciates it. She looked around the room, making sure everyone was following her reasoning. If I had jumped up this morning and started listing my accomplishments or trying to prove how tough I was, what would that have accomplished? It would have been about my ego, not about being useful to the mission. But weren't you angry? Jessica asked. I would have been furious if people were saying those things about me. Sarah smiled slightly, the first real smile many of them had seen from her all day. Oh, I was annoyed. Don't get me wrong, but anger doesn't make you stronger. It usually makes you weaker. It makes you react instead of respond. It makes you focus on proving yourself instead of improving yourself. Commander Patterson, who had been watching this entire exchange with obvious approval, stepped forward. Sergeant Martinez has just given you all a masterclass in military leadership philosophy. The strongest leaders are the ones who don't need to constantly prove their strength to others. They demonstrate it through their actions when it matters, not through their words when it doesn't. He addressed Sarah directly. Based on your performance today and your demonstrated qualifications, I'm recommending you for immediate consideration for officer candidate school. Your experience and leadership capabilities suggest you could be more valuable to the military as an officer than as an enlisted soldier." Sarah's eyes widened slightly in surprise. "Sir, I appreciate the confidence, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of responsibility again." "With respect, Sergeant, you've been ready for years. You just needed to remember it." Patterson's expression was serious but encouraging. The military needs leaders who understand the real cost of leadership, who've been tested under actual combat conditions, and who have the judgment to make difficult decisions under pressure. That's exactly what you offer." He paused, then added, "Of course, the decision is entirely yours. You could also choose to return to enlisted service in your previous specialty or explore other options within the military. But I wanted you to know that Officer Candidate School is available to you if you're interested." Sarah was quiet for several long moments, processing the unexpected opportunity. The morning had begun with her questioning whether she belonged in the military at all. Now she was being offered a path to commissioned officer rank, a level of responsibility and leadership that would exceed anything she'd achieved during her previous service. "I'd like some time to think about it, sir," she said finally. "Of course. Take all the time you need." Patterson turned to address the entire group. "Before we conclude today's processing, I want to make one thing clear to all of you. What you witnessed today, both the initial assumptions and judgments, and the way those were addressed and corrected, represents exactly the kind of learning experience that makes people better soldiers and better human beings."
He looked around the room, making eye contact with each recruit.
"You've all learned something valuable about the danger of assumptions, the importance of respect, and the difference between appearance and reality. More importantly, you've seen examples of real courage, both in how Sergeant Martinez handled unfair treatment and in how several of you took responsibility for your mistakes." Patterson checked his watch, then continued, "Your formal processing will conclude with individual interviews over the next 2 days. Use that time to reflect on what you've learned here today. Think about what kind of soldier you want to be, what kind of leader you want to become, and what kind of person you want to be remembered as." As the formal briefing concluded, the recruits began gathering their belongings and preparing to leave. But instead of the excited chatter and competitive bravado that had characterized the morning, the conversations were quieter, more thoughtful, more respectful. Several recruits approached Sarah individually to shake her hand, thank her for her service, and express genuine admiration for how she'd handled the day's events. She accepted each interaction graciously, offering encouragement and advice to those who seemed genuinely interested in learning from the experience. Kelly lingered until most of the others had left, clearly wanting to speak with Sarah privately. When they were alone, she approached tentatively. "Sergeant Martinez, I know I already apologized, but I wanted to ask you something else," Kelly began. "What's that?" "How do I make sure I never treat someone the way I treated you today? I mean, really, make sure, not just promise myself I'll be better, but actually change the way I think about people." Sarah studied Kelly's face, seeing genuine desire for self-improvement there. "The same way you get better at anything else. Practice. Make a conscious effort to look for the value in every person you meet before you look for their weaknesses. Ask questions before you make assumptions. Remember that everyone has a story, and most of those stories are more complicated and impressive than they appear on the surface." Kelly nodded thoughtfully. "And if I mess up again? Then you apologize sincerely, learn from the mistake, and do better the next time," Sarah replied. "That's all any of us can do." As Kelly turned to leave, she paused and looked back. "Sergeant Martinez, thank you. Not just for accepting my apology, but for showing me what real strength looks like. I hope someday I can be half as strong as you are." Sarah watched Kelly walk away, then gathered her own belongings and prepared to leave the recruitment center. The day had been transformative in ways she never could have expected. She'd arrived questioning her own worth and capabilities. She was leaving with renewed confidence in who she was and what she had to offer. More than that, she'd been reminded of one of the most important lessons from her military service: that true strength isn't about proving yourself to others. It's about being useful, being reliable, and being the kind of person others can count on when things get difficult. As she pushed through the glass doors and stepped back into the afternoon sunlight, Sarah Martinez was no longer the uncertain woman who'd arrived that morning. She was once again Sergeant Martinez, decorated combat veteran, proven leader, and someone who had earned the right to serve her country at the highest levels. The tattoo on her back would always carry the names of the 8 soldiers she couldn't save, but now she remembered that it also honored the 14 she did save, the countless missions she'd completed successfully, and the bonds of service and sacrifice that connected her to something larger than herself. 3 days later, she would call Commander Patterson to accept his recommendation for officer candidate school. 6 months after that, she would graduate as Second Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, ready to begin the next chapter of her military career. But the lesson from that day at the recruitment center would stay with her forever, and with everyone who witnessed it. The quiet woman who'd been dismissed as weak had reminded an entire room of people that real strength is often quiet, real courage is often humble, and real heroes don't always look like what we expect them to look like. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one nobody notices until they choose to be seen.